process, as well as where information would be available should this DPA get adopted by council. And then at the end, as Anya said, will be available for any of your questions and for discussion. So just taking a step back, for those that aren't aware, a development permit area is a policy that local governments have the authority to designate for lands where they want to control development or development for certain purposes. So we have a watercourse protection development permit area. So we regulate development within the riparian area of a creek, as well as wildfire development permit area. So it allows us to provide guidelines to the community in order to regulate what is developed in these areas. So back in 2020, the planning department completed a preliminary coastal planning study. So we engaged with some consultants and we looked at the coastal flood hazard area and started to look at possible mitigation measures to protect the community against sea level rise and coastal flooding. We brought this forward to council back in November of 2020, and at that point received direction from council to bring forward a foreshore development permit area for consideration to help as one mechanism to help against sea level rise and coastal flooding. In addition to that direction from council, they also requested that we hold this virtual meeting or workshop to provide information to impacted property owners and community members so that they're clear on the process and have an opportunity to ask questions in advance of this policy being adopted by council. So today we've reached out to many groups. We've reached out to potential impacted homeowners on the waterfront, the general public. We've engaged with some of the groups, the Shoreline Preservation Society, stream keepers. We've reached out to the whole building community, contractors, developers, and architects that work regularly in the District of West Van, environmental consultants, surveyors, and First Nations groups in order to ensure that everyone understands what this policy would allow. Sorry, sorry, I'm just, the slides aren't changing for me. There we go. Okay. So we have a panel of people today to help answer questions. So myself from the district, as well as Mr. David Hawkins, who's a senior manager for community planning and sustainability. And as well, we have two external expertise. So this is Jordan and Susan from WSP Canada, which is an engineering company. They've helped us with our coastal planning study last year and are here today to answer any questions. Jordan is a coastal engineer, so helped us with the modeling of the coastal floodplain area. And Susan is a marine biologist that contributed some background on the biology of the intertidal foreshore and the potential impacts to that area. So first, going into some background of how we came to where we are today. In the official community plan that was updated in 2018, there are some priorities to update the shoreline protection strategy and flood construction level requirements for development to further increase protection from sea level rise. In addition, there's a priority to establish a foreshore development permit area. And council's priorities for this year were to direct staff to address the threats of floods, and these include coastal flooding. So we've received direction from council. In addition to that, as some of you may be aware, there's been other ongoing initiatives that have also led to this work. So the district's Coastal Marine Management Plan Working Group that is wrapping up this spring, I believe, have worked on a plan to address the district-specific coastal management challenges and produced some guiding management for the coastal environment. And these are around the sections of built infrastructures and parks, coastal dynamics and ecosystems, and the public-private interface. And this policy would go into the public-private interface section of their plan. In addition to that, We've been working with other partners on the North Shore for in development of a North Shore sea level rise strategy, which completed this past winter. And we worked with the other municipalities as well as the First Nations groups and the Port of Vancouver to better understand the impacts of sea level rise on the North Shore, looking at flood hazards, risk, and potential adaptation opportunities for each of the municipalities to consider moving forward. And so both of these plans included a recommendation to prepare a foreshore development permit area as one adaptation tool. And this adaptation tool is to protect homes and property and people on private property. And I should specify that the development permit areas only addresses development on private property and not on the public foreshore. So the district's objectives with this foreshore development permit area is to minimize the risk to people and property from coastal hazards. And this is sea level rise, storms, and flooding. We also want to support coastal management to reduce the flooding risk. So supporting the working groups plan and the North Shore Initiative. And at the same time of protecting people and property from coastal hazards, we want to ensure that the development permit area preserves and protects the intertidal habitat of the foreshore. So we want to ensure that while people are developing near the waterfront, that they're also protecting the sensitive environment of the foreshore. So those are the district's objectives. Now, how this benefits a property owner. This would be to protect your home and property from flood damage. As some of you may be aware, in the low-lying areas of the district, the winter storms do cause some flooding damage to waterfront properties on an ongoing basis. And so we're trying to address that issue. It protects the foreshore area for environmental, aesthetic, and recreational benefits. And it provides a consistent framework for permitting of development activities. Just stepping back a little bit, the district has been following some guidance from the province on safe development within the coastal floodplain area since 2018 when the province updated their guidelines. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. But this work that the district has been doing and requiring of property owners to develop in a safe manner has been unclear and has caused some frustrations. And so we wanted to put a framework in place and a permitting process in place that's clear and consistent across every property. And this also would raise awareness to homeowners and potential buyers of flood risk. So you would be aware that this is a concern. You'd be aware of the guidelines. There'd be information available. So you're aware of everything that's happening upfront prior to purchasing or prior to making a decision on whether to redevelop your property and how to redevelop your property. And at the same time, it also builds resilience from coastal flooding within a community. So just a step back, sea level rise has been occurring over time as the warmer oceans are from ice melting and more water. And so the sea levels have been rising. That's a very general overview. I'm not going to get into the very detailed specifics in this meeting. There has been shown to be sea level rise historically for the Vancouver area. It's about 0.04 meters. And around the globe, it varies given due to local conditions. There is new science now that is showing that sea level rise is occurring at a faster rate compared to historical records. So we can't use what's been happening historically to project into the future. So right now, the province, or in 2018, have provided some guidance to municipalities to plan for a 1 meter sea level rise by the year 2100. And this could be used to help making land use decisions in coastal hazard areas. So following that guidance, there's various ways that you can protect a community from sea level rise. And these are the different mitigation measures that can be considered. And so you can resist sea level rise by building up land in front of properties. You can accommodate sea level rise by raising homes to protect against sea level rise and flooding. You can avoid by moving all development outside of the coastal floodplain area, or you can build up land in front so that the homes are protected. And so some of these are unrealistic for West Van, given that there's a lot of private properties along the waterfront. So moving all of those homes out of the coastal floodplain is unrealistic. So the foreshore development permit area would focus on the accommodate mitigation measure, where we would work to raise homes and protect against them for sea level rise. And so the province in 2018 updated their flood construction level calculation. So this is the elevation at which a house can be safely developed. And this would be their new calculation accommodates a 1 meter sea level rise. So taking all of that into account, so the way, just quickly, and I'm not going to get into too much technical detail, but the flood construction level, or the FCL as I'll call it, is calculated by taking into account the water level, land subsidence or uplift, tides, wave effects, and then this 1 meter sea level rise. And you put that together and you get the elevation at which a house can be safely developed. And so the district is using this guidance to direct a development in the coastal floodplain area. So now we use this, as I said, we engaged with WSP, with Jordan and Susan's team in 2020 to look at the coastal flood area. And we calculated an FCL for the entire coastline. And these are conservative measurements of FCL because we couldn't look at site-specific conditions, but we did take into account the wave effects and tides for the coastline, and we calculated an FCL all across the coastline. And so we used that to define the development permit area. So the development permit area is all properties in orange. And I know that you can't see this very closely or identify your property if you happen to be a homeowner. But just generally, this is the proposed development permit area. So these are all the properties that are at an elevation at risk of coastal flooding. And so that's how we define the development permit area, because we want to ensure that all of these properties, when they come to redevelop or they want to do work, that they are they have the controls to protect against coastal flooding. And this is approximately 840 private properties. So that includes commercial, private property, like single family homes, the marinas, and et cetera. So now I'll get into, after we've provided some background, I'll get into our draft guidelines for consideration. So how we developed the guidelines is that there are 9 other municipalities in BC that have foreshore development permit areas, and many of them are actually on the island. Campbell River is an excellent example of a good development permit area for coastal hazards. So we used their guidelines, or we drew from their guidelines. We also looked at Green Shore's reference guides, and Green Shore's is a mechanism to look at naturalizing your waterfront area. So removing hard structures and making more of a natural vegetated area to protect your home against erosion and your property against erosion. And it helps dissipate wave energy and that sort of thing. So we use that resource as well. And then we use the provincial guidelines for climate change adaptation and flood hazard area land use management. So what does this mean if you're a homeowner? So if you're planning to subdivide your property or build on your property, the guidelines would provide controls for building elevations and locations on your property to reduce flood hazard risks. So as I mentioned, the flood construction level requirement. If you're planning to landscape or alter your land in any way, there's controls to protect the natural environment of the foreshore. And I'll get into more details in a bit. So when is a DP needed? And when I say DP, I mean a development permit. So when do you need to apply for a development permit from the district? If you're going to subdivide your land, you need to apply for a development permit prior to your subdivision application. If you're going to construct or add on to a house with living space, so where people will actually be living. if you're going to be constructing any type of building or structure within 15 meters of the natural boundary of the ocean. So the natural boundary of the ocean is typically right near the waterfront property line of many of our properties, depending on surveys. It's where the high tide mark is. So we want to ensure, we consider this sort of a buffer zone or a riparian area of the intertidal habitat of the foreshore. And we want to ensure that this is protected as much as possible to ensure that the sensitive environment of the foreshore is protected. And then if you're altering land within 15 meters of this natural boundary of the ocean, including tree removals, major land alteration, you would need a development permit. When is a DP not needed? If you're doing any renovations to your existing buildings that doesn't expand the footprint, you wouldn't need a development permit. If you're doing routine maintenance of existing landscaping, provided that you're not removing vegetation and replacing with non-landscaping materials, so removing vegetation and placing hard structures, or if you're not removing any trees. And if you're doing any land alteration outside of this 15 meters of the natural boundary of the ocean, so doing major land alterations, you wouldn't need a DP. And this is particularly a point for some of the properties within the development permit area that are not right beside the waterfront. So they may be further back and they're still at a low elevation, but they're not directly adjacent to the foreshore area. They would be subject to the FCL, the flood construction level requirements, but they wouldn't be subject to this 15-meter buffer area because they would be well outside of that. So the guidelines related to the flood construction level and building a new house with living space. So your new build would have to be above the flood construction level. So you would engage with the coastal engineer to calculate what the flood construction level would be for your property. All mechanical and electrical infrastructure and access points need to be above the FCL or in flood-proofing measures. For your stormwater management, so this would be at the building permit stage. If you're outletting your stormwater to the ocean, you need to account for the flood construction level. Your site grading, if you need to raise your site, needs to account for the flood construction level. And your landscaping, and this is an important one that we've been dealing with for the past couple of years. It needs to address the grade differences to adjacent properties. So we do recognize that these requirements might mean that you need to raise the grade of your property and in relation to adjacent properties. So your landscaping or your proposed landscaping needs to address these grade differences to ensure you're not impacting views, but you're also protecting the privacy of your adjacent properties. We want to see all structures and buildings located 15 meters from the natural boundary of the ocean. I do recognize that 15 meters is typically greater than your zoning setback from this waterfront property line. So if there is a time when you need to encroach into this 15-meter setback to put in a structure such as a patio or something, an accessory building, you would need to engage with an environmental person to propose measures to protect the foreshore area. So, and this is partly so to ensure that people are not just using seawalls to build up the grade of their property, because we have seen that seawalls produce scour and erosion to the foreshore area. So we'd be looking for proposals where if you needed to have a structure for some reason, that you would look at bioengineered structures such as vegetated walls, or placing vegetation in front of your structures so that the foreshore area was not impacted. So you would need to provide that type of proposal in your development permit application. There's specifications for bringing in fill if you needed to raise the grade for the flood construction level. And then recognizing that some sites are very constrained. All sites are different. We do understand that. So there will be times that if for you to meet the flood construction level to build a house, you might not be able to obtain that on your property within the zoning bylaw requirements. So we would consider variances to the zoning bylaw to attain the flood construction level. So for example, we have seen proposals or applications where they've had to vary the height variant or height of the building to achieve the FCL, or they've moved their house further back from the waterfront within the other front yard setback in order to achieve the FCL. So staff would consider those variances to achieve the guidelines of the Foreshore Development Permit Area. So recognizing all of those requirements, if you choose to build within the coastal floodplain area, there are certain things that can be built below the flood construction level. So these are things such as outdoor facilities where flooding would cause minimal damage. Renovations to an existing building that might be below the FCL, you'd be allowed to do that without having to raise your house. If you are going to construct a carport or garage, because it's not living space, it could be below the FCL. And then other minor buildings such as storage buildings, greenhouses, those things can be built below the FCL. And then this one, these exemptions from the FCL come right from the provincial guidelines. So this one is any addition that might be to the house, but that's below the FCL. So if you have a house that you know is below the flood construction level and you wanted to add to it to increase the size, as long as it's less than 25% of the existing floor area, then you'd be allowed to build it without having to raise it up to the FCL. And this is to allow for small additions to existing houses. Now, in cases where someone would want to double the size of their house or do a very large addition, that wouldn't be possible. They would need to look at where they could build that above the flood construction level. And then commercial space would be exempt from the FCL requirements. And this is because this isn't living space. People are not spending all of their time in there. And so we've allowed that to be below the FCL, and we're looking at the Ambleside area. It's a Horseshoe Bay areas where it'd be difficult to raise certain commercial space above the flood construction level. That being said, we do have concerns that if these areas were to flood and the electrical and mechanical infrastructure did flood, then there could be hazards created to adjacent properties or to people. So the expectation or the requirement would be that you would have to engage with a qualified professional to come up with flood mitigation measures. So ensuring that you have safe access points, ensuring that your mechanical and electrical infrastructure are protected so that a fire wouldn't start or something like that. So we've covered how we can protect people and property from sea level rise. And now there's also the element of protecting the foreshore environment. And this is the restrictions within this 15-meter area of the natural boundary. So we want to preserve as many healthy trees, shrubs as possible, vegetation in this area. And if you need to replace it, we want to ensure that what you're replacing the vegetation with would be species that are suitable to the coast. And the Green Shores guidelines or references has excellent references and lists of vegetation that will be suitable for this environment and to provide, to contribute to the foreshore intertidal area. So we would also want to restrict any hard structures from being put in there. So this is going back to when I mentioned that we don't want to consider seawalls put at the property line in order to build up the grade of your property. And I'll get into a little bit on the next slide of why it might be not actually the best approach when moving towards the flood construction level. And we've seen that a lot of the walls have increased the scour and erosion in the foreshore area. And so for new developments, we want to move away from these type of structures. I do recognize that there's many properties that have seawalls already existent that are holding up their properties. This is not a mechanism for the district to go in and require removal of these structures, but moving forward, we want to see if we can minimize it as much as possible and improve the intertidal habitat of the foreshore. So we would like people to consider removing hard structures and replacing with natural features. And as I said, if you reduce this 15-meter setback for any structure, we need to include recommendations to minimize the impact to the foreshore area, as well as any archaeological sites or resources that might be in the foreshore area. So now, just providing a little bit of background as to why we're developing the guidelines to protect the foreshore. So there's been a lot of evidence to show, and we've seen it with some properties that have redeveloped on the waterfront over the past couple of years, that a naturalized shoreline. So when I say naturalized, I mean a beach area shoreline with vegetation and logs and boulders, that with no man-made hard structures. These actually decrease the wave energy coming onto a property. So it increases the resilience to flooding. So if a wave comes into a natural beach area, it tends to dissipate and move down the shore. And then that also enhances the shoreline habitat and the connectivity of sand and materials moving along the shoreline. Conversely, on the bottom image of the screen, you can see that if a seawall is placed right at your property line, it actually increases the wave run up and the wave energy coming onto your property. So the wave comes and hits the seawall, and the wave goes over top of the seawall because there's so much energy that's created. This actually, we've seen in calculations of construction levels, has actually increased the elevation of the FCL because of this overtopping and wave energy. And it also, in front of the wall, you can see a lot more scour and erosion of the foreshore area. So then you need to look at ways to mitigate against that. And as sea level continues to rise with these coastal flooding, and we're actually seeing a loss of intertidal habitat because there's a coastal squeeze and less intertidal area. So there are actually quite a few benefits to looking at a naturalized shoreline approach should you be looking to redevelop, and it could potentially bring your flood construction level down somewhat, so you wouldn't have to raise the grade of your property quite as much. So this are just some considerations as you're evaluating your redevelopment options. So now that I've gone through the guidelines, I'll just give a bit of an overview of how the permitting process would work. So if you needed to obtain a development permit for any work on your property, I would really suggest that you engage with staff, my team, as early as possible, just to make sure that you are well aware of everything that you need to do. So you would be, and we will provide all of this information on the website once and if the Foreshore DPA gets adopted. So if you wanted to have and redevelop your property, if you wanted to build a new home or subdivide your new home, you would complete and submit your DP application, and we would provide a submission checklist for everything that you need to complete. And this is done prior to the building permit application. And we do this because we see efficiencies in completing the development permit prior to the building permit application, because there is a lot of back and forth to establish the development permit. If you're requesting zoning variances, that goes through an evaluation process. And so if you submitted the building permit application at the same time, it's not as efficient, because that building permit review would need to be held until your DP is sorted out and approved. And so we are finding it easier and faster and more efficient to complete the DP and then apply for your building permit. And we would provide the submission checklist. Once the application is submitted to the environment group, we would internally review it and determine whether it needs to go to other departments. So if you're requesting zoning variances, the planning department would need to be brought in, or if there's any requirements related to the engineering department or whatever, we would circulate internally. Once the guidelines are met, the DP would be approved by the Director of Planning. So we're proposing that this foreshore development permit area is delegated to staff for approval, rather than having to go to council for approval. So right now, if you're developing on the foreshore, in the foreshore area and the coastal floodplain area, and you need variances to the zoning bylaw, you need to apply for a development variance permit, and that goes to council for consideration. It can be a long process. And so we're trying to streamline the process by having approvals at the staff level. So it would be approved by the Director of Planning. and the development permit would be issued. We'd collect a security deposit to ensure all the conditions are met. And then the development permit is registered to your land title. And so that it runs with the land, so that every future owner or future redevelopment is aware of the conditions of the development permit and the requirements to build to the flood construction level. You can apply for your building permit following that and move on as normal. And then at the completion of the project, we would complete a final inspection by the environment group to ensure that all the conditions of the development permit were met. And this would be done prior to occupancy and prior to the completion of your building permit, because we want to ensure the development permit conditions are met before the building permit is closed. If everything is good, the security is returned and the project is completed. So next steps, as we indicated, this is a virtual meeting to receive feedback from the attendees on this draft Foreshore DPA. It's still in progress with staff. And so the next steps would be is following this meeting and a period of leaving time to allow people to email with questions. We would finalize the DPA and bring forward for council consideration. And once it comes to council for consideration, this process before it gets adopted includes a public hearing. And so this would also be an opportunity for the public to ask questions, look more closely at the development permit area, whether your property is in or out and how this would affect you. So this is not by any means the last time that you can engage with staff on this process. And then once it's adopted, all of the we would create a new Foreshore DPA webpage on the District of West Van website, and all of the application submission requirements would be there. We would have frequently asked questions. We would have contact information to ensure that any applicants would have all the information and could engage with staff to ensure a smoother process. So with that, we want to open it up to questions and discussions. So we want to frame the questions and discussions so that everybody can provide feedback and ask questions. So we will continue to use the FCL guidance from the province in this policy, and that's guidance that was developed through science. They've provided calculations and methodology to obtain the flood construction level. So we will be using that, but we want to ensure that members or community members today, if whether they have any other questions. So we want to know if the application process was clear, if we missed anything that you want to see addressed, is there more information that's needed, or there anything else that needs to be protected or considered that I may have missed previously. So we want to ensure that we hear all of your feedback. My colleague, the Environmental Protection Officer at the district, Marie, to ensure that we've accurately documented everything that you've brought up today. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Anya to open up the question.